Hey there, and welcome back to the Lightroom Develop module. When you last saw Brad and I, we were working on going through the basic functions here, and now we're going to go and look a little bit into the tone curve. Now, the tone curve is a pretty interesting tool. It can allow you to change things such as contrast and also color balances in different parts of the image. So from left to right here, first of all, we have a little tool. If we click on that little tool and we hover over our image, if you look on the graph in the tone curve window, literally the tone curve, you'll see that it will place a little doodad along that line. That is representative of wherever we're hovering over at that moment. Whether it's, more of a mid-tone, bit of a, well, it's not even quite a highlight, shadows, blacks, etc. We're going to put this away for now. We're going to go on beside adjust. You'll see there's a few options. We're going to click on the first one. It's the parametric curve. And this is going to give us a very similar view to what we just saw, but if you mouse over the actual graph here, you can see that it's got various different, representations. If you move down, you see that there's a little heading that says region and highlights, lights, darks, and shadows. And so these are these regions. And you'll notice at the bottom right here, it will mention which one you're hovering over in addition to actually essentially highlighting it here. As you might expect, if we click and hold and move, in this case up or down, we're going to get a change in the image. We're going to get a change in the shape of the curve, and we're going to get a change here in the slider and in the associated number here. So whether or not we click and drag the curve, or we move the slider, or we click and drag on the actual values here, we're going to get a very repeatable change in our curve. As we go to the right, we're actually brightening up whatever it is, in this case the darks. If we go to the left, we're bringing them down, we're darkening them up. Now, you'll notice the curve will constrain itself to this highlighted area. And only to that highlighted area. You don't get any fine control over it. Just what is prescribed by that shape. And this can be actually pretty useful. But it is on rails a little bit. So let's say I wanted to bring up the shadows in this image. I would come to the shadows. I would click and hold here or one of any other ways, and I would move to the right, and you can see a corresponding increase in the brightness of the shadows in the image. Let's then say I wanted to increase the lights. We're going to just move that. The curve's going to follow its predetermined path. And you can see here, this portion gets actually a little bit too bright. Looks almost like he's glowing from the inside out. If you notice up here, our curve's now actually touching the top here. It's not really what we want. So I guess 100% on the lights is too much. We'll bring that down a little bit. That looks a little bit less bad, but it's looking a little off actually. I think we put the shadows up a little bit too much. So we'll just start over. Let's see here. These are the highlights. What happens if we bring the highlights down? Not much, to be honest. Bring them up. Not much. Then we look at our curve here. Our histogram is the dark portion that lies behind the rest of this curve. And yeah, indeed, there's not really much highlights there to change. So we have to sort of change some of the other portions of the image, and basically this isn't going to do anything. If you remember from our last session, how do we change what counts as a highlight? Well, we can change the exposure, and now we've added stuff into the highlights. I can now come here and actually affect things. You see that made this part of his face quite white almost. Bring it down. Oh, a little too much. It turns gray. So this is one of the reasons why this tool has its limitations, because you can get some really weird effects because you're isolating different parts of the curve, and it's not maybe allowing you as fine-tuned access as you might otherwise expect or desire. And one more thing we want to come down here for, we see we have these 3 adjustments, 75, 50, and 25. As you can imagine, it's splitting this thing into quarters, and we have dark, less dark, lighter still, and then light. And this is segmenting these particular parts of the graph. So let's say we drag this to the right. We're now influencing the size of what counts here as a light. So now, just things we're getting a little bit of a different response. Let's reset that. Let's say we brought the middle slider. You can bring it quite far to the right. As you can see now, we have quite a lot of room to work with in the darks. We're saying that this portion here belongs to the darks. And if we bring this other slider all the way, well, we're not getting quite the same effect. Let's see, crank the shadows all the way down. This is, in its own right, actually quite interesting as an image. You can see we got quite a weird curve there. Just going to double click on this. You can see how our curve changed, right? Let's bring it back. So by changing the positions of the sliders here, we're actually changing what counts as our darks and shadows and lights and highlights. And we can change how much we're able to actually affect them by changing these various parameters. So this takes a little bit of trial and error, a little bit of practice to figure out how best to use this, but it is something worth exploring. I really encourage you to do so. However, we're now going to move on, and we're going to click on this little white circle right next to our little S-curve there. And you'll see we get a very, very, very similar looking curve. This is the point curve tool. And that said, though, we have a lot more control. So there's a couple of things we can do. First, just demonstrating, you can grab any portion of this curve and move it and anchor it in any way you want. That said, as we can see by the image, things can really go wonky quickly. Just going to reset that. So that being said, we can use this in a number of ways, and we can use the point curve to really affect a lot of useful contrast changes and get more granular control than we can over here. That said, we can adjust the contrast, adjust these values, and also adjust the tone curve to give us the best of all worlds, so to speak. But also, as you might expect, things are a bit linear. I would always recommend starting with exposure, changing these values as you see appropriate before you come down and do the tone curve. Because if you do the tone curve and try and come back here, as we mentioned, you might really shake things up even with just a little bit of exposure change. But that being said, let's explore the rest of this particular window. You see at the bottom here it says point curve linear. This is the linear line. You have two options, medium and strong contrast. I'll just click medium, and we can see it's put a little bit more contrast into the image. But it's also put a bunch of anchor points on this curve, and it's made a little bit of a dip here towards the shadows and blacks. If we go strong contrast, as you might expect, it accentuates that curve a bit more, puts a stronger contrasty look on the background. This, I think, is probably closer to what the actual image is meant to be, as opposed to this, which is the out of camera raw. But let's say we've done all this and we want to go back to normal. We don't want to hit reset and reset all of our work. We just want to reset this particular curve. Well, you can go and right click on each individual control point and then delete the control point. But that's a little bit arduous. You see, by doing that, we actually now are dealing with a custom curve, which you can change it to your heart's content. If we click on custom here, we can actually now save this as well. However, if we go back to linear, it's going to reset things for us. So that's a good thing to remember. It's a really easy way to reset things. Now I'm going to bring your attention back to this little tool that we talked about. Because if I click on that tool and I hover over any part of the image, you'll see that the anchor point moves up and down the curve. Now, let's say if I come over here to his forehead and I click and hold and I move my mouse up, you can see it's going to deflect the curve upwards. If I move it down, it's going to deflect the curve downwards. And of course, this is going to affect the image. So this is a really easy way. If you know that I want this part brighter, you can come, click, pull up, find a spot. Oh, maybe I wanted this darker. Come, click, pull down, and then we can really change things up. Here I accidentally clicked two different spots, added two anchor points. I'm just going to delete one. I guess the official term is control point. But here we're able to add some contrast. So basically, if you pull the line down, it gets darker in whatever section you're dealing with, whether it's, the lighter parts, the darker parts, or the middle parts. If you want to make the brights bright, you grab near the end and you bring up. If you want to make the darks dark, you grab near the bottom of the curve and you pull them down. And that's how the particular curve can introduce contrast. And because we do get to make these subtle choices, we can actually get really fine control and change the individual sections very, very specifically. So, what's actually happening here? Well, this part of the curve anchored down at the bottom. This part of the curve anchored up at the top. The top is highlights, the bottom here is shadows. If we click and hold on this bottom control point, you can see I'm bringing it up. This is also achieving an increase in what's called the output, and this will go up to 255. So the output is now 100% white, 255. If we come down to the bottom and we move to the right, you'll see that the input starts to increase again up near 255. Much like everything in Lightroom, there's a lot of redundancy. I can actually click on this value and change it. but it looks like I am prevented from getting this all the way to the right. For whatever reason, I don't get to go all the way to 255. But you'll see that by increasing the input on the bottom end of the tone curve here, we're actually putting a lot of things into the darks. Ooh. When in doubt, point curve, linear, and that'll reset things. The same type of nonsense happens if you click on the top control point. If you slide to the left, you're decreasing. Oops. Sorry, my mouse slid there a little bit. You're decreasing the input. And you can see we're getting brightening again, but it's different. It's not quite the same. It's not going to pure white. And if you go on the right-hand side again and you pull down, the output is going to drop. And we're going to go into pure black. That's what these input and output values are. They're affecting the two endpoints. Now let's put a quick little bit of contrast on our guy here. I'm going to bring the midtones up a little bit, bring the shadows down, bring the highlights down a little bit. Don't want them to get too far below or they'll go wonky on me. See, now he's cyan. I'll just bring it down a little bit. Now, you can see there's a little slider here that says refine saturation. So it's pretty self-explanatory. We can correct some saturation shifts by moving this slider. Here, if watch Brad's lips, you'll notice that as I go towards the right, they'll get a little bit more magenta. A little more saturated. If I bring it to the left, they'll desaturate. This is here because as you boost certain parts of the image, you can introduce some extra saturation or uncover some saturation. This is one way to deal with that. That being said, we'll reset to linear. And yeah, essentially, this is a really useful way to affect some contrast in the image. It's not necessarily the most useful for doing your beginning processing. Like, for instance, it's much better to get the exposure where you think it would be a little bit more usable and adjust things like the shadows and what have you up here, and then refine them here, because here you're acting on the curve, or on the histogram rather. The curve is acting on the histogram, but it is whatever histogram you're feeding it. So here we can go a little bit more dramatic. Maybe not even that dramatic. And we'll bring that point down. You can see if I try and take it a little too far, things get real wild. It's actually kind of neat. But essentially, really getting rid of the contrast in his face, but we can increase the contrast in the background. I've got too many control points now. It's gone all wonky on me, but you get the idea. So powerful tool, really nice for adjusting contrast and getting, a nice refined effect based on what your particular needs are. That being said, there's actually 3 more circles here. And we'll just start with the red one. And you'll see that it splits things up. We have our same curve here. We have our same point curve. But you'll notice when I click on the contrast here, it's not actually affecting this red and cyan curve, right? It is putting the contrast in. So what's going on here? Well, this is a way that we can change the color balance of various channels and have that be very specific to different parts of the image. For instance, we can change the color balance just in the shadows, just in the midtones, in the highlights. We can change it differently depending on which ones we want to affect. So let's say we wanted to warm up the midtones a little bit. Or put a little more red. We can put a little red into it. You see how? Here, I'll just go a little too far. We're putting a little too much red in there. However, I can actually bring these portions down a little bit, or try to. And this is, just to show you what's actually happening. Here, this portion of the graph, as we can see here, it kind of like a little hump and it disappears. This is the brightest portion of our image, the histogram here. So when I push the brightest portion into the red, the brightest portion of the image takes on that red. Now, of course, this looks terrible, but you get the idea. You'll notice there are portions that are turning a little bit green or a little bit cyan. That's because when you pull the curve, it creates a bit of a dip opposite. So, but you can actually come in if you need to and anchor things linearly, like so. And here we've got that effect. Exaggerated, mind you, but that's kind of what's going on there. We'll reset that. We'll go to the green circle. Here you're dealing with green and magenta. You might remember green and magenta from our white balance section up here. You notice the red and cyan is missing, but those are two very important colors. But in this case, when we're dealing with the white balance, it's not so important. But we do have the ability now to change the white balance and tint, in this case tint, depending on where or what part of the image, the shadows or the midtones or highlights. It's quite useful. Blue circle here, this is more the temperature. We can cool things off, warm them up, warm certain parts up, cool other parts off. It is very, very useful if you have an application for it. For now, we're going to reset that and we're going to move on to some non-Brad examples. So we're going to go to library here. And let's see. Here, we'll select this image right here. This is an image I took at Dinosaur Provincial Park. And don't let it fool you, it's not black and white actually. Go to the Develop module. Scroll all the way to the top. We'll see that black and white's currently selected. Actually, if you take a look, you'll notice there's quite a lot of things that have been changed. What's going on here? Well, when I exported this particular image, I went File, Export. And in File Settings, I selected DNG. You can also select Original, but I believe I put this into a DNG. And here, it's going to, give you some compatibility options and a preview size. However, what happened is it also embeds the edits that I made in Lightroom. So those edits now travel as metadata with the file, and it's been distributed to all of you with those edits. So that is what's happening there. Just cancel out of that for now. So, needless to say, I'll just hit reset on this image, and you can see this is not a black and white image. But I think it's very interesting to think about black and white images, and I think it's, at least in my case, I find them a desirable thing to create. You might agree or disagree in your own work, but we don't, in the modern age, have quite the appreciation for black and white photography and the various skills and the eye it took to actually be really good at it because we see everything in color for the most part. Our cameras show us an instant preview in color. That being said, things in color can actually show up differently than they do in black and white. I'll just go back here, right? Things are a little bit different here as compared to here. Mind you, this is the raw, and there are a little bit more edits on the black and white file, but one thing that you need to keep in mind when doing monochrome is how you see the world, because there are situations where a photo actually might look better in black and white, and I would contend that this is one of them. So here I'm out at Dinosaur Provincial Park. There's this big rock formation. I was quite lucky. I got the moon positioned right here. I got myself positioned at a good spot. I've got some visual interest, but it's almost a little bit busy. The moon and the rock formation aren't really the star of the photo. This rock slab here is pretty prominent. The sky, we can punch the sky up a little bit, but basically this could be a good color photo, but I had a little bit of an inkling that it could be an even stronger black and white photo. So if we go back here, why do I think that? Well, probably the strongest inclination came from there's sort of a window here. Do you see? We've got the white clouds. They're bright. Then we've got a strip diagonally across the image that includes our subject. And then the shadow here creates another bounding line. And we get this sort of like highlights, midtones, and shadows kind of effect here. And I thought that was just really serendipitous. That was pretty cool. I do enjoy the way that the rock and the grass here, are very contrasty against the shadow. And I thought, well, heck, this is just a pretty good black and white image. So I would not ignore this black and white button right here. And I would, if you're so inclined, try and see the world in shades of gray, no pun intended, because you need to be able to see the world like this, knowing that without the color present, what types of things are going to be most prominent. But that being said, we'll go back to library and we'll select another photo here. This one, still carrying edits from class. We'll go back to develop and I will just reset this photo. As you can see, not all is what it appears to be. This is a blue hour photo in the mountains. We've got illumination here in the back. We've got, if we zoom in here, we even got stars, a lot of blue, a lot of darkness in the mountains foreground here. So, what on earth do we have to work with? Well, if we pull up the exposure in the basics panel here, you'll see that we have quite a lot. We don't actually have too much that's lost. If we zoom in here, if we really zoom in, we can see that things are a bit noisy, a bit crunchy, but we can still see all the trees on the other bank. Like, this is actually a river. So yeah, there is a lot of information still in this file. In fact, when we boost it up, it almost seems like daytime, right? So if we draw our attention up here to the histogram, we'll see that we've got something interesting happening. We have a high contrast situation. This is where we have our peaks on the edges, and we've got a bit of a saddle in the middle, but they peak in different colors. The shadows have a lot of red and green in them, and the highlights and the whites have a lot of blue. So we're getting high contrast, but in different color channels. So let's experiment. Let's click black and white. And all of a sudden, things have taken a bit of a change here. We still have a very prominent blacks and shadows portion of the graph, or of the histogram here. However, it does taper off. We've now lost a bit of those highlights and whites. You can see, actually, what was sort of blown out whitish blue is now just everything shades of gray. So if we were to increase our exposure, changing nothing else, we do get that saddle shape back. We are moving towards higher contrast here. We'll actually bump the contrast, and you can see how much it accentuates that histogram. And here we can see it happening in the photo itself. We've got less grays now, the darks are darker, the lights are brighter comparatively. If we do the opposite and really bring down the contrast, we actually get more of a bell curve. It pulls itself away from the edges and gathers up in the middle, and we have more shades of gray here, more of mid-grays. So these are two different type of contrast situations, and this is something that we can actually play with. So we'll just bump the exposure up a little bit, and we will, without touching the contrast slider here, we'll put more contrast into this image. So I'm going to bring up the highlights. You can see we're bringing things up on the right hand side. I'm going to bring the shadows down. I'm going to bring the whites up. I'm going to bring the blacks down. You can see we're now very high contrast, and we've got that saddle shaped graph here. Another way to do that, just reset some things here. As we talked about not too long ago, here's the tone curve. So if we put a strong sigmoidal shape into it, we can accentuate that saddle shape in our histogram, as well, just looking at the photo, achieving a really high contrast scenario. You can even go a little bit further with it. So this is pretty extreme as far as the tone curve goes, but you get the idea. So what if we wanted the opposite? What if we're a little bit more a fan of the low-key look, low contrast? Well, we just kind of literally do the opposite. We'll bring the highlights down. See, it's pulling the graph or the histogram away from the right-hand side. We'll bring the shadows up. It's pulling the graph, it's pulling the histogram away from the left-hand side. We'll bring the whites down, and we'll bring the blacks up. And we've got quite a different histogram here. It's very bell curvy, big hill in the middle, nothing on the sides. And if we come over here and we go to our History tab, and we find the right point, which is right here, you can see the results are quite divergent. So that is a very cromulent way to do that. However, you can, of course, use the tone curve. Bring the blacks up a little bit. Bring the top down a little bit. Bring that down a little bit. You got to be careful not to go too far when you're dealing with anchors. Get rid of that one. You can also double click on any of these control points to send them on their way. But you get the gist. you can really wash things out quite nicely using the tone curve. We'll now find a new image here. This was one that I had everyone do a little bit of independent work on, and essentially we'll just reset it. Here we have our out of camera image, and we can convert it to black and white. Now there's a couple of things that have actually been done to this image, and we can actually walk through them if we come over here. I'll just go through our history window, and you can see all the changes that I was making as I tried to make the image pleasing to myself, more or less. Now, there's a few things that you can notice when I move the mouse. Can you see it? So in the final image, we've removed some things, and we've changed selectively the presence of certain things by changing their brightness. And we accomplished both of these things using masks, or rather masks and healing, I should say. So in the case of this ghosting here, we're actually using the healing brush, and we're getting rid of that little ghost there. We also removed a little rock that was in the water over here. See if I can, there you go. You can see it right there. The other thing that I wanted to do is I liked the grass here. I liked its presence, but it was competing in monochrome with the sheen off this rock. So went through and I used masking. And we got rid of, or selectively just brushed over the grass, brought it up, and brushed over the rock and brought it down a little bit, de-emphasized it. And you know what? Not saying that I was entirely chuffed with the results, but it's a good exercise. Let's get some exercise with that brush there with the masking. Where are we going? Okay, here we go. Do a little bit of Aurora. So, this particular image has already been processed. We'll just reset that. And here's our starting point. So we're going to go over to the masking menu. And this is really useful for someone like me who does a lot of astrophotography. Masking the sky can be really, really useful. And they have a button for that. So we'll click it. And what do you know? It masked the sky for us. You can see it does get a little bit feathered and fuzzy towards the edges, but that's perfect because we don't want it to look like a cardboard cutout. But I also want to work on the foreground. It'd be great if there was a way to just invert this and duplicate it. Well, if you click on the three dots next to mask 1, you'll see one of the first few options here is duplicate and invert mask. Here we go. Now we have an inverted mask. And just to help me keep track of things, I'm going to click on 3 dots, click rename, go foreground. I'm going to click on 3 dots next to here, go rename, and type sky. And that's going to help me a ton, trust me. So we're going to select sky. Just going to take the overlay away. And we're going to put some selective edits into the sky here. Maybe we'll bump the exposure up. Maybe take the highlights down a little bit. Bring up the shadows a teeny bit. The whites. I want to darken the blacks, but see, we're getting some vignetting. It's not necessarily what we want, so I might change the contrast a bit. It's starting to really emphasize the aurora there. That's totally good. We can also adjust the saturation, get a lot of different options here. And this is where the tone curve can come in handy. So let's click on the green circle. And if you remember, the tone curve can change the color that exists in different portions, such as in the highlights. So I'm going to click on the adjust, bring it over to the aurora, click and hold, and I'm going to bring it up just a tad. And that's going to increase the greeniness, essentially, of, I guess you call them the highlights. Now, what if I come over here and you find that we're now firmly in the shadows blacks region? I can click and hold here and bring that down a bit. I can take it too far. You see how it's turning it purple, essentially. It's putting a lot of magenta in there. I can put a little bit more magenta. I think that looks quite wild, so we'll leave that for now. That's pretty cool. You have all kinds of things, effects, the texture and dehaze, for instance. We can increase the dehaze a bit. Just for giggles, we'll go all the way to the left. You can see green, so it's counteracting that with a little bit more of the cooler colors, maybe the magenta. But I think I'll just leave it pretty close to standard there. Why not? We're going to forego some of the other adjustments here. You can explore these, but these are pretty self-explanatory in case you don't know what moire is, or sometimes pronounced moire. This is a thatched pattern that is a result of high-resolution sensors which have a grid pattern and taking pictures of textiles that also have a grid weave pattern, and the two interacting in funky ways. This can help with that. Defringing removes the fringe off things, such as, here we'll zoom in Navigator. There we go. Get rid of fringing. You can see how it's affecting the fringing around the star. It's getting rid of some of that blue. There's actually a better way to do that specifically, but you can accomplish that type of thing there. But I digress. And here, now I think we're pretty good with the sky. So let's come to the foreground. I would really like to be able to see this building. So let's increase the exposure. Oh, that's great. I love seeing that building. Maybe we can just quickly muck around with it. Make it look the part. I think a little spooky here is warranted. All right, so we've got that. I think that's pretty good, but there's two complaints I have. One, this part of the image is a little too bright, and this part of the little shack here should be a lot brighter. So what can we do? Well, foreground, we can click on it. We can add or subtract. And I'm going to subtract because I want to subtract from this portion. And I'm going to go with the brush. I love my brush. I get a nice big brush here. The flow and the density I'm going to put down like 50%. Because I do want a little bit of this to come through. And now I just paint, basically. You can see it's getting darker. Just want to de-emphasize it. I don't want it to go away entirely. I think that's pretty good. Now I want to add this portion in. So I'm going to click Add. I'm going to go Objects, see what my results are. See, now I get this little cursor. It's sluggish though, because I think it's constantly recalculating what it's doing. But I'm just going to select our object here and see if it can detect it. All right. So the only thing here is, I don't think there should have been a little sub thing on the foreground here. So I'm going to delete it. And we'll just do things a different way. We'll click Create New Mask, Objects, and we'll trace it again. Hey, success. So now that we have this mask, just going to bring the exposure up a little bit. There. Perfect. I think that's just exactly what we wanted. Now, you know, the fun thing here is that I'm not sure that we really messed about too much with any of the standard tools. We did that all in the masking menu there, which is pretty cool in my estimation. So we're going to go back to library now. We're going to select this photo here, and we want to do a little bit of work. I want to keep the moody sky, but I want to make the foreground moody as well. I want there to be some contrast. So we're going to start by adding a little contrast. You can see this has made this quite dark, so I'm going to counteract that. And if you look up here at the histogram, you can see exactly what's going on, right? The sky is over here. This is the foreground. I'm going to bring the shadows up a little bit. Now here we've got this rather imposing sky. So what are we going to do with that? Well, you can play with the vibrance maybe. The texture. Clarity. Ooh, that's getting nice and crunchy. I think it's okay to put a little color in. It's artistically relevant. Here I want to bring up this portion. I can't really do it specifically. Ooh, but that I do like. So here we have just a shallow curve. I do want to preserve things here in the foreground. I'm going to anchor this curve. Back up towards the linear portion there. Drag that down. Yeah, that's quite interesting. That is quite interesting. And I will maybe even, I'll warm things up a little bit. We've got a lot of blue in here, so it's going to help fight it. But I love the touch of, warmth and yellow here. It really brings a little bit extra punch to the sky here. So that's another edit demonstrating some changes here in the tones and using a little bit of curves. That is pretty neat. Okay, now that we've got that done, what else did we work on in class here? Yes, this image, Taylor Swift. Actually, we have this one here first. We have this group of people. We're going to reset. What we did here is use the tone curve in its entirety to kind of play with things here. So I'm going to reset it. And you can see we have, a daylight balanced image, I think. But it's a little bit drab. These people are dressed in white. They're someplace nice. They're having a good time. Let's see what we can do with this. First thing I'm going to do is actually pull the graph up in the middle. It's going to brighten up everything a little bit. Next, I'm going to grab my little adjuster tool. I want to isolate this lady's shadow under her hat. I'm going to delete this point here. There we go. Just to open things up a little bit. So the shade and the face can be something that you might have to deal with. I'm gonna bring the highlights down a touch, kind of making this a little bit lower contrast, I suppose. That's maybe okay. Still a little bit bothered by the shadow, but restricting oneself to only the tone curve, I don't know that it's super possible. And we're also going to make things a little bit warmer. So just going to grab the faces. Make it just a teeny bit warmer. Putting some anchor points on the curve just so it doesn't get all wonky. And yeah, here's how we can turn a little bit of a drab photo into a bit of a higher key photo. We're going to come back here now though, and we're going to select Tay. This was not my plan, mind you, when I found this photo, but it was within some samples. So this is a real audience member photo of Taylor Swift. So I'm just going to bump the exposure a little bit, contrast maybe a little bit. And what we want to do here is we're going to play with some other tools. So we're going to go below the tone curve. Ooh. And we're going to end up with the color mixer. Now, depending on if you've ever clicked off of this, you might start in point color. This is the new fancy thing that Lightroom is doing. And essentially it makes changing colors really, really easy. We're going to grab the eyedropper and we're going to click on the pink behind her head on this arch. See, it's now isolated things here. We can change certain parameters such as the hue, the saturation, and the luminance. And I want you to watch this arch in the background. What's going on, folks? Changing all of the complete color of it. Well, you literally are. You're changing the color of it. You're changing the hue. And because it's essentially masked things out specifically for this, you get a lot of specificity. Saturation you can change, really saturated, not a lot. Luminance, bright, not bright. And then you can change the range. You can visualize the range to see what colors in the image are actually being affected. You can come over here and restrict them a little bit more or open them up a little bit more. You can see how that's affecting things. Ooh. So it's very powerful. That being said, of course, we've got the old-fashioned way, the mixer. So there's two choices. You can come down here to adjust. It says hue, saturation, and lightness or luminance, and color. Essentially, it'll display most of the information just in a different way. So for the color mixer, we can click on, let's say, orange, change the hue of the orange, although you can see it's affecting Taylor Swift as well, which isn't necessarily what we want. You can change the highlights, or the saturation rather, and the luminance. And you can do that with any of these colors, or globally here by clicking on this icon. Now, if we come up here below Mixer where it says Adjust Color, we can click on that and do HSL, Hue, Saturation, and Luminance. Here you can just select the one you want, luminous, saturation, or hue, and you can change it to your heart's content. Some of them aren't always going to be in your individual image, however, or at least enough to make a difference. But that's for luminance. There's also saturation and hue, and those all count the same as if you clicked on them in the color over here. Two different ways to do similar things. That being said, the HSL menu, you get that little dropper thing where you can just click and drag. If we move down below Color Mixer, now actually I'm going to reset it really quick. So if we're in Hue, Saturation, and Luminance, and we click on this little icon, I'll give you a little example of something that can happen. Let's come over here, click and drag, and you'll notice now two values are changing, red and magenta. Now, as long as I don't let one of these values hit the edge, I can return them both to 0 at the same time. But since they move at different rates, if I go all the way to the edge with one, and then all the way back, essentially, there's no meaningful way for me to get them to line up again. Now they're in a race forever, and neither will ever win. So every time you hit the stops, it will affect things a little bit differently. So just be cognizant of that. We'll close Color Mixer here and we'll go to color grading. And we get, some similar stuff here actually. Where it says adjust, you'll notice we've got these 3 circles just like we have here. And we can click on 4 more. And it tells you what they are. And essentially you can adjust various things. And there's something that I really find useful. We can change, of course, the highlights and the shadows and that type of thing. But here we have finally access to midtones. And you can very easily put a little bit of spice into a photo using these midtones. So we'll just come down here and we'll grab the slider and we'll bring it up. And you see, it's just making things a little bit nicer, I think. A little bit brighter. If you come to the bottom, it says blending and balance. These will adjust these parameters. So you might want to actually play around with balance, and it will change which parts are affected by that change in registration from the midtones. So I think somewhere around here it highlights Taylor Swift a little bit better and makes her pop. Now we can access all of it just from these little icons, but if we click here, shadows, and then we've got, equivalent little circle adjusters here, little color wheels. And we can, of course, change the luminance of the shadows the same as we did. We can, of course, change the luminance of the shadows the same as we did with the midtones. And we can affect a little bit of extra change there. However, you'll notice there's a little planet, there's a little center bit. I can move the center bit around, and it's changing the color of everything in this photo quite drastically. You can see there's a little preview here. It's essentially showing what hue you're using or exploring, I guess. But let's say you wanted to do that, make things a little bit more blue-purple. You can also grab the planet. Let's say if you've got this part on lockdown, you can grab here and explore every color under the rainbow, essentially. And the same works for midtones and, of course, highlights. And if we, again, adjust the highlights, we can grab the whole planet, pull that around. This is more of a specialized tool, I would say, but it's something that you can get a lot of mileage out of if you have some color casts and whatnot that you want to rectify. But one thing I would recommend remembering is about that midtone slider. Oh, there's also another icon here. This is global for the whole photo. So we'll adjust these parameters within the shadows and the highlights as well. But we won't necessarily mess with that. It's not going to really add anything for us. Underneath color grading, we have detail. Detail deals with sharpening and noise reduction. So sharpening essentially refers to how sharp I mean, I didn't really mean to go to her armpit. Forgive me for that, but it deals with how sharp details look. So by default, Lightroom sharpens up to a value of 40, and I think that's way too much. So I'm just going to strip it away, and you're going to be able to see what it actually looks like and what the preview here looks like. Sharpen a lot, you'll see things get real gritty, but if we don't, they're a little bit blurry. So let's say this was a good value for us. Radius refers to the radius or the like physical dimensions, how many pixels it should be taking into account here. Detail, it's going to try and preserve detail through micro contrast, I believe. And then masking. Masking, you might ask yourself, what is this? It'll actually blur out some of the sharpening that you did, but in a way that still makes the sharpening worth it. It's going to look different than it did stock. So that's pretty easy. Sharpening isn't so much a concern anymore. A lot of modern cameras are very sharp lenses. Autofocus is very good, but you might need it, so it's right here. For noise reduction, you can opt to use their built-in AI noise reduction. It'll create a copy of the file as a DNG, I believe, and it stacks it up with the original. That being said, you know what? It doesn't take a lot to teach you to click a button. Let's do a manual noise reduction, however. Come in here, and we're going to crank the sharpening just for giggles. Reduce the masking. Want it to be as crunchy as possible. And while we can do that noise reduction button, we're just going to play around. We're going to boost the luminance and watch this portion particularly. It goes from having a real strong grid pattern to being just a solid color. I think that's quite fantastic. It's really getting rid of a lot of the noise. It is softening up Taylor quite a bit, however. So what can we do to sort of rectify that? Well, we have this detail slider, and the detail slider, the more you slide to the right, the more details it shows. You can kind of see it's starting to try and bring out some texture. It's like very local sharpening or local contrast. It's not really doing the trick either. Let's try just straight up contrast. Not much effect. Detail by far. But really what the issue is we crank the luminance too high. So we'll bring that down a little bit. There you go. It's getting rid of some of the noise, but it's keeping important features intact, such as, any kind of skin texture. Next we have color noise. And it's going to be tough to find an image with color noise in it. Okay, here, let's find, here we go. Well, this explains why I couldn't find it. Okay, so color noise reduction comes in handy for me, especially as an astrophotographer, when I'm dealing with some color noise. First thing I'm going to do is actually put it down to 0 because it comes in, Lightroom bakes some in by default. We're going to also crank the exposure. We're not actually trying to make a good photo here. This is just for experimentation. We're also going to crank the vibrance and saturation, and we're going to zoom in. And what you should be seeing is, strangely, little bits of green, little bits of purple or magenta, little bits of yellow, little bits of blue. Quite a bit. This is supposed to be the sky. But because of the way that your sensor in your camera is set up with their pixels and their Bay array, and because you have areas that are less well exposed, like the corners of an astro photograph, here we can tend to not get enough exposure and thus get a lot of noise. That said, we can fix some of that. So this is pretty typical of an astro photo, especially the corners of an astro photo. There's not really enough actual light from distant suns like these stars to tell us what color things should be. So these areas get predominantly dominated by noise. Now, you probably would never notice it had I just left it black or whatever, but this is a little demonstration. So we're going to come down here to color noise reduction, and we're just going to crank it. And you see very quickly, while we don't lose some of the patterning of space, we do lose those colors specifically. So pull it back very quickly, mind you. So the color for me, the color noise function, the noise reduction of these areas for me are really important. So I use this tool pretty regularly. So detail and smoothness here is somewhat cohesive with some of these ones we played with earlier, especially in the sharpening. We've got our color noise. Once that's reduced, we've got our detail and smoothness. So if you want to try and add a little bit of detail back, if you think you lost some, you can use this slider, and smoothness here has its own drop down. You can see it is affecting things, especially a little bit of that color. Using this tool is really easy to deal with this type of color noise. So I would highly recommend keeping that in mind because it might come in handy one day. And with that, I think we've covered more than enough for today, so we'll leave the rest till next class. Thanks so much for watching.